Just a little while ago, a couple of months ago, you wrote a very good article in Current Affairs magazine. The title was Rent Control is Fine, Actually. Now, rent control in economics, it's like kryptonite. Yeah. People will cringe, they'll
Mm.
curl up in a ball if you say anything positive about it. Where did your interest start and why dig into this? What about rent control makes it worth communicating better to people?
Yeah, I think my interest in it did start from this unlearning economics perspective, I suppose. It's the supply and demand model tells you that, you reach a market equilibrium and that's optimal. And if you introduce a price control, like a cap on rents, then what you end up with is like an undersupply of rental units, because basically landlords aren't willing to supply that many rental units at this below market price. So that's a pretty straightforward prediction of the Econ 101 model, and it applies across all markets according to the model. A minimum wage will lead to unemployment by a very similar logic, and any price controls in, I don't know, let's say the energy market over the cost of living crisis would also lead to an undersupply of energy. So that's a pretty standard prediction. Now, depending on where you're taught, you'll be taught it with a bunch of caveats. I think if you're taught it at Chicago, they'll say this is how the world works, and it's only the woke socialists that will tell you otherwise. If you were taught at Manchester, like I was, the professor will be like, don't worry too much about this. It may or may not be true. But I do think that when we're talking about the public arena, rent control seems to be hated by economists and by a lot of centrist types and technocratically minded people. If you look at IGM polls, which are like polls of academic economists, I think there's a 2012 one where everybody's like, yeah, it does reduce the supply of housing. And the some of the comments are quite funny. I think Richard Thaler said, next question, does the Earth revolve around the sun? It's like as if
Mm,
it's physics, right? As if it's that
that
unquestionable.
degree of evidence, eh?
Yeah, yeah. It's really, really vociferous, this opposition to rent control. And I just thought that after reading around about it, the evidence seemed not completely out of whack with what the economists were saying, but just nowhere near enough to support the degree of objection to the policy. I just thought it was way overstated, and there are a few points. One of them is that there's this confusion that when you implement rent control policies, it reduces the like housing construction and the total amount of housing. So this economist Assar Lindbeck said, rent control is the best way to destroy cities except for bombing.
Mm.
As if it like really reduces the overall supply of housing in a way tantamount to actually blowing them up. And I think the Adam Smith Institute as well, who are a very neoliberal think tank in the UK, they said that it would cause landlords to demolish existing units, which I mean, they're really reaching there. There's no evidence for that. That's ridiculous, right? It's just rent control was implemented, so I blow up my building, and like how much like money, like just sell it, like it's just ridiculous, like so. There's all of this opposition, and it's just far too much, and there is no evidence that it reduces new construction. And there's a whole bunch of studies that look at this. There's one in Massachusetts, in the USA in 2007, which looked at the abolition of rent control and found that there wasn't a construction boom. There's also this review by, I forget the name, which looked at a whole bunch of rent control policies and found that there just was no change in construction. And yeah, it seems to just come from this Econ 101 model. I think people are basically placing the model before reality, and they're getting confused, and that leads to these absurd statements about rent control. And I want to reiterate, every policy has costs, and there are badly designed rent control policies out there, just as there are badly designed other policies out there. We do need to make sure that rent control is well designed. We do need to acknowledge that there are going to be some costs to it, but the way the policy is discussed just doesn't leave any room for these nuances.
Yeah, exactly. I think some of the key sentences that you wrote, were basically along the lines of, yeah, rent control is really bad if you only look at the costs and not the benefits. Like, yeah, so is every
Yeah,
policy. That
yeah.
I don't know if you wrote specifically that, but that's the vibe I
That
got.
would be a good line. I don't think it's in there, but I should have, yeah, I should have
Because
put that in there.
there was this great Rebecca Diamond study that you go into detail about, and this is common in all fields, by the way. The result in the paper is that the quantity of homes available in the pool of rent controlled housing fell 15%.
Mm,
So they've called that supply, because supply is not the number of homes, it's a willingness to sell. It's like a special economic term, right?
mm.
And they've said, oh, so there's 15% fewer houses. That's bad. And nowhere did we get to the point that further down in the study, they go, oh, yeah, like 8% of them were renovated and improved, and we built more
Yeah,
houses, and 7% of them were shifted out of rent control into, or were sold to private owner occupiers, which is also something we think is desirable. So we've got sort of two desirable things: renovating houses and getting higher home ownership. And we join them together and say, no, that's a bad thing now, because that's less supply of rent controlled housing. And I'm like, that is so um what's a what's a good word? I'm drawing blanks. It's just such a deceptive way to
yeah.
represent the
I was going to
nuanced,
say that.
yeah, hey, you do this
Dishonest.
policy. It's dishonest, yeah. You do this
It,
policy,
it it
people
is, yeah.
react by X and Y. X and Y is both good and bad. And this is the net effect. But no, it's like, oh, supply falls for 15%, the city's destroyed. And anyway, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I do think it's a blind spot, and I think it's caused by exactly what I was talking about. This idea that the houses do just disappear, right? And that it is actually a reduction in the total supply of housing somehow. And they don't say that, but they kind of act like it's the case. They act like this 15% just disappear. And it's like, no, there are first-time buyers, right? So rent control, by the way, historically has sometimes been used. I think in Hong Kong, there's a researcher called William Thorne who was telling me this, and he's doing his PhD thesis on rent control. But in Hong Kong, early days, rent control was basically used just as a way of encouraging home ownership. It was
Yeah,
like because they're going to sell. No, it was basically saying, you can't really rent except at a heavily discounted rate, so sell it to someone so that they'll buy it and then they can own a home.
yeah, you can
And
go and
that's just
invest the
missed.
money elsewhere. This is exactly
Yeah.
what happened in Australia with the Second World War rent controls. They were sort
Mm,
of kept on afterwards to sort of say, hey, you should sell those homes to owner occupiers, because we're not letting you earn anything else from rent
mm.
for quite a while. And it was a real part of that huge boost. Um, yeah, so the so there's this sort of weird dishonest representation that 15% of houses are what burnt to the ground suddenly, when actually it was just a reorganization of ownership structures and
Can
investment.
I add something else as well, which is
Yeah,
that so the ownership, I think I forget which way around it was. Like maybe 7% went to owner occupiers and 8% were redeveloped into non-rent controlled housing, or the other way around. But roughly half and half,
yeah,
right? Of this 15%. And the ones that went into housing that was still rented but not subject to the controls, right? This housing, because of the way that rent control policy is designed in the modern age in San Francisco, but also elsewhere, landlords had to reinvest and renovate it. So they had to improve the quality of the housing through investment in order to justify escaping the rent control.
yeah,
And this is a complicated effect. Again, I want to stress I don't have all the answers here, but it seems to me that that is an intended consequence of the way rent control policies are designed today. What you're saying is you want to jack up the rent. Okay, well, do something. Sort
mm,
sort the apartment out. Improve it. And then so that's an intended consequence. But there's this notion that like all of these are just unforeseen, unintended consequences. The homes disappear down a black hole. It's a bad policy, and we just don't really consider these questions of whether some of these outcomes might be desirable.
yeah. I'm totally with you. We get that a lot in housing because, I've been doing a lot of housing research lately. One thing people say, so in Victoria, in Australia, they increased land taxes on investor landlords. And the consequences of that were exactly like rent control. It decreases the net incomes to investor landlords. And so some of them choose to sell and invest their money elsewhere. And the lobbying was fierce. It was like, oh, the supply of rentals is going down. Look at this,
Mm.
um, totally oblivious to the fact that the only way to get higher home ownership is to switch the houses that aren't being bulldozed from being owned by landlords and rented by a household to being owned by that household. It's the only
Yeah.
way. And
Yeah.
we just sort of pretend that no, we can do this other magic thing where we have higher home ownership and more landlords and rental homes as a subcomponent of the total. I'm like, you can't have both. And it's this weird sort of picking and choosing things I like and ignoring the other side when, the good thing about economics is we're meant to be trained not to do that, right? We're meant to
Mm.
be trained to look at trade-offs and the costs and the benefits and all
Mm.
the effects. But I feel like there's a real strong social signal here. Would you say rent control is one of those things in economics where, if you say it's fine, actually, it makes you a heretic, it puts you outside the
Yeah.
club. Have you
Oh, I'm
found?
definitely. Yeah. I'm definitely outside the club. I mean, do you know Dan Davies, the economist? He wrote a book called The Unaccountability Machine.
I
He
know
blogs
the
at
name of
Crooked
the book.
Timber.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. He's always good for a quip, and in his book he says that he thinks that the term economist, is a bit less like physicist and a bit more like Trotskyist. It's kind of an
Oh,
ideological commitment, right, rather than it is a sort of a type of science or even a discipline. So I think that's true, right? And there are a few ways that you affirm your allegiance to this club. And one of them is very much, I think, being against rent control and price controls in general. I think sometimes these days economists would make an exception for the minimum wage. I think the weight of evidence on that is that it really doesn't reduce unemployment, contrary to the Econ 101 model. And David Card, who pioneered that, won the Nobel in 2021. I think that battle's kind of been that battleground's been conceded by economists. They're like, okay, the labor market's different, but still, price controls anywhere else, I don't think they'd really be happy with them, and that's like something that it makes you a non-economist. And I actually think so. Isabella Weber, who was
yeah.
arguing not for rent controls, but for price controls in the energy
During
market in
COVID,
particular
wasn't
during
it?
the cost of living. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. So it was I think it was his name, Alan Sanderson, one of the Chicago economists, put her statement from the guard in a Guardian article saying the government should introduce price controls in one of his exams, and it said, how would a real economist respond to this?